This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Jeff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Sammy Obeng, Executive Director of Parliamentary Network Africa, a very warm welcome to the Human Coined podcast.
Thank you so very much for having me. Great pleasure.
Glad you're here. Let's start with getting to know a bit about your organization. Tell us about PN Africa, as you're known, your mandate and your reach across the continent.
Right. So PN Africa, we like to describe ourselves as a convener and connector of civil society organizations that are working at engaging and monitoring their respective national parliaments across the continent of Africa. We work with the vision of an Africa where all parliaments are open. And when we speak about open parliament, we're talking about parliaments that are transparent, parliaments that are accountable to the citizens they serve, and parliaments that encourages citizens' participation in the work of parliament. So we bring together civil society organizations across Africa to better work with their national parliaments, but also to hold national parliaments accountable, to monitor the work that parliaments are doing. And for these civil society organizations, we provide capacity building for them, peer-to-peer learning through what we call the Africa Parliamentary Monitoring Organizations Network. So it's a continent-wide network. And we also do this for journalists who are reporting from parliaments across the continent through an initiative we call the African Parliamentary Press Network. So we basically bring civil society in the proper sense of the term civil society, both CSOs as organizations and then journalists as well as the people to be closer to Parliament, understanding how Parliament works, opportunities to engage, but also holding parliaments accountable. And that's the larger framework of what we do here at PN Africa.
When you talk about parliamentary monitoring organizations, let's take a moment to define that, because as you know, I do a lot of work in capacity development with parliaments. But monitoring is a little bit of a different role and a different relationship. Can you talk a bit about the contrast?
Yeah. So there's always been this confusion, even for us as civil society organizations working in Parliament, on whether the term parliamentary monitoring organization is the most effective term of art, to use for the work that we do, because our work really is not just about monitoring Parliament. It's not just about watching, the watchman, so to speak, but it's also very heavy on parliamentary engagement. But I think it's been a term of art which, since the early 2000s, when parliamentary development work, peaked in a way that was allowing for the building of a community of practice, of civil society organizations that works with Parliament. And the term parliamentary monitoring organizations was used, and we've actually maintained that. So for us here in Africa, when we say parliamentary monitoring organizations, which is abbreviated as PMOs, we intend it to mean organizations that engages regularly their national parliaments or sub-national parliaments, or even regional parliaments like the Pan-African Parliament, the ECOWAS Parliament, the East African Legislative Assembly. So regularly engaging these legislative assemblies, it's an important one for what defines a parliamentary monitoring organization. So you can have a local chapter of Transparency International in a particular country that engages parliaments regularly on all anti-corruption draft legislation that get laid before Parliament, or a gender-based organization that is engaging Parliament on gender legislation or gender policy that is taking place in Parliament. These organizations are defined as part of the PMO community that we are trying to build. But there are also those organizations whose work involves, monitoring Parliament, monitoring attendance of members of Parliament, tracking, legislation, ensuring that members of parliament are doing their work according to their mandate, ensuring that the institution of parliament are doing their work, producing scorecards and what have you. So all of these organizations, whether you're doing hardcore parliamentary monitoring, whether you are being the one who is watching the watchman, so to speak, or you're engaging parliament on a regular basis, fall within the category of PMOs, parliamentary monitoring organizations. So for the purpose of this podcast and whatever engagement that, viewers and listeners relate to PN Africa on, PMO is defined in this context.
Yeah, and it's interesting because my work has been more on the capacity development side, as I said, but I feel very strongly in the Canadian context, for example, we're a federation. We've got 14 legislatures, federal, provincial, and territorial, that we very much need parliamentary monitoring organizations. And what I see as the primary difference is, as a capacity development person, I'm always positive in the way I phrase things. I'm always careful to, especially when I'm traveling outside my own country, of course, but even inside my own country, trying to phrase things in a positive way, and look at best practices. But sometimes I look at the legislature in the province that I live in, which is the province of New Brunswick. I look at the way the Public Accounts Committee performs here, for example, and they need a serious wake-up call in order to improve their operations. I sort of see the PMOs as being more willing to part with flattery and courtesy and really call a spade a spade. If I'm right about that, how do you reconcile that with maintaining good relationships with all these organizations, with all these parliaments?
In our engagement with PMOs across the region, we've had PMOs who, are your hardline, who is watching. I mean, if Parliament is supposed to be the legislative branch that oversees the executive branch, then the question always remains: who watches the watchman? Who is ensuring that this institution that is supposed to oversee the executive branch is doing exactly what the various constitutions in our countries is mandating it to do? And who is ensuring that they would call them out if they are not doing the right things and all of that? And so, yes, you've got that. But many of the organizations we work with will also tell you that it's always important to also try and ensure the fine balance between, holding the big stick over Parliament, so to speak, and also ensuring that Parliament will listen to you when you have propositions on reforms that needs to be taken up. So it's always a thin line between whether you are doing the naming and shaming, or you are essentially engaging the institution for reforms. Many organizations have learned the trick of navigating both paths. So there are. I mean, you go to Kenya, and Mzalendo Trust would annually, release the scorecard on the performance of members of parliament. And whenever they release it, you'd have members of parliament, upset and angry and what have you. But Mzalendo Trust is also able to position itself in a way that it goes to the institution of parliament and work with them on legislative reforms and on other, policy areas that parliament is supposed to take up. It doesn't happen always like the Kenyan example I've just cited with our member organizations. And Mzalendo Trust is one of our member organizations, by the way. You have countries where organizations that are doing hardcore parliamentary monitoring work are literally sidelined by parliaments because parliaments are not very happy with, the criticisms that they receive, the scorecards that are put out. Members of parliament, see the effect, the electoral effect on them when these things are put out. And so you have such organizations, cut off, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. You have countries where organizations will not even dare attempt doing hardcore PMO work because parliament will come at you. So there is always the need for that fine balance between, an institution that is so important that we need really to make sure that the various reforms that we are looking for, the various legislative things that we are looking for to take place, how do you still work with this institution and yet be able to call them out when they don't do things right? It's always a very interesting balance that we we try to navigate. And it's part of the things that we build capacity on regularly as PMOs across Africa, even as we work together, sharing experiences from various countries and learning from each other.
Yeah, so interesting. And I think of the workshop that I had the pleasure of attending with you in Mombasa in April or May of last year, and specifically on the oversight of public debt, regional workshop that was put on by the NDI and the Host Democracy Partnership. And I'm sure you were in the room when a very prominent member of Parliament openly attacked civil society organizations for their work, and I was really shocked. I really shocked. So when I look at this Canadian applicability, which is not really the purpose of this interview at all, but I guess it's something that I was thinking of, right? How to apply this in Canada? There will be hostility to that constructive criticism, especially if we're ranking jurisdictions, and we're going to talk about your index in a few moments, the Parliamentary and Open Parliamentary Index. But there wouldn't be a hostility to civil society. How much of an issue is that still in Africa when you're trying to bring parliamentary organizations or parliaments and civil society and media together?
Well, it is important to note that in a world where civic space is constantly shrinking, in a world where the elected class, political elites, political class constantly see civil society organizations as threats to them simply because things are being exposed, simply because there are a group of people who are speaking out, simply because there are a group of people who are engaging their constituents, the people who would ensure that they are being voted back. You would usually have that kind of pushback. The situation in Africa, just like anywhere else in the world, is a mixed situation. There are some countries where you have some very fantastic working relationship between civil society and parliaments, by the way. And of course, there are places where the hostilities are great also because individual politicians, individual members of parliament seem to lose the essence of the importance of civil society work and how it connects very much to the work of parliament. And so usually see these people or see us in civil society as enemies, of the political class, without recognizing that there is a lot that we bring to the table, So it's a mixed situation. Places where you have great experiences, great examples, great working relationship between civil society and parliament, and places where you have some very, very terrible relationships and experiences between civil society and parliament. But it's a civic space thing, and we're all grappling with it. But I think we also as civil society have a responsibility to point out to these parliamentarians, to these political class, that there's a lot that we bring to the table. Many of the politicians have cited examples of how people work within the civil society space only to build a certain reputation to come and unseat them in the next elections. But the statistics really show that these are fewer people than the many that are actually doing the work in the various places to advance the cause of humanity. And really, if parliament would take, especially for parliament, I want to narrow this to parliament because it's the space that I operate mainly in. If parliament would take a very critical view of civil society and the work that we do, they'll realize that we are a very important complementary component to the work that they do. They are interested in oversight. We are interested in oversight. Many of the parliaments in Africa are under-resourced and so are unable to have the research capacity and research human resources that they need. Civil society brings that on board. They want to represent the people or the constituents that they represent. You have NGOs working down there at the grassroots in their various communities, supporting the very people that they represent. So we must be seen as allies, really, rather than foes in many of the instances.
And let me take your statement and be much more radical. Considering I'm sitting here in my comfortable perch here in Canada, I would say that parliaments around the world, including my own parliament and legislatures, are failing to live up to their constitutional oversight responsibilities. You look at the Ghanaian parliament, for example, that has from an oversight perspective, that doesn't yet have a budget committee. I think they're just coming around to having a budget committee that will hopefully allow them to play a more vigorous role in the formulation and approval stages of the budget, where there is an opportunity for public participation. No state-owned enterprise committee, so very little oversight over state-owned enterprises, for example. And Ghana would be one of the countries you would look to as a leader in terms of effective public accounts committees or experienced public accounts committees. So I would actually say that parliaments are not able to play, for political reasons, perhaps for capacity reasons, their constitutional role. And without civil society, there really is no real hope for improvement. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I think that yes, parliaments can do better. I must admit that when we started, and we're going to go into the conversation on the Open Parliament Index. When we started the Open Parliament Index, we started
feel free to use that as a segue. Yeah.
We started it on the premise that, when we talk about parliaments, how accountable they are, how participatory they ensure that the work that they do are, how engaging they are, we usually miss out on what the baseline is. So, on what basis would you say that the Canadian, legislature is more open than the Ghanaian legislature? Because there's no universal benchmark to be able to, and that's why we started the OPI to serve as a baseline, first of all, to see using globally accepted, benchmarks on what makes for an open parliament, a transparent parliament, an accountable parliament, a parliament that is engaging citizens. How do we use those global benchmarks? Benchmarks that are globally accepted by members of parliament themselves through the Interparliamentary Union and through other, parliamentary associations. Benchmarks that are globally accepted by civil society in the case of the Declaration on Parliamentary Openness. Benchmarks that are universally accepted by governments in the case of the Open Government Partnership, OGP, to put them together to now have a baseline to be able to say this is where you are really measuring along these bench lines, and this is where you must get to. And so anytime that you work towards getting to the points that you must get to, you are scored for you to see measure the level of improvements that you're making. I'm citing this example in direct reference to the question that you asked about whether parliaments are failing us, and usually you will be able to measure a failure when you have a yardstick, with which you want to measure. If you note that the pass mark is 60, anyone who falls below 60 would then be deemed to have failed. But if the pass mark is uncertain, usually then you are contemplating whether the 80 guy has failed or is a 40 guy who actually, failed and what have you. And that's what we are trying to do with the index. But we also live in a world where the excesses, overreach of the executive branch on the legislative branch makes it so difficult for the legislative branch to operate as co-equal branch of government. So the executive is determining how much the legislature would even spend in many of the countries. Executive branch fails the legislature with members because they are both, they are practicing some form of a hybrid system where the legislatures are also, members of the executive branch. The executive branch wields a lot of power and resources, and so makes the legislature more like subservient, really, to the executive branch instead of being the co-equal branch of government. And this really affects the way and manner in which parliaments operate. So the challenges that militate against parliaments around the world are many. And until we address those, many challenges, we'll have some of these situations where parliaments are not seen to be doing their work very well. But, to end that up, parliaments themselves must take up the responsibility in recognizing that, look, your destinies are in your hands as parliaments. You must be able to, assert yourself as an important arm of government for people to take you seriously.
Let's talk a bit about the survey. So what were your sort of key findings? The Open Parliament Index, which covered 13 countries in West Africa. What were your sort of key findings? What were the issues that concerned you the most?
Okay, so on the onset, what did we set ourselves to do? We set ourselves to have an index that is able to measure the level of transparency, accountability, and citizens' participation in the works of Parliament. And we set ourselves to use benchmarks that will be acceptable by all parliaments. 3 benchmarks. One is a global civil society benchmark known as the Declaration on Parliamentary Openness, which defines, 44 principles that makes for an open, parliament. The second is the benchmark on a democratic parliament, which has been put in place by the Interparliamentary Union, the IPU. And the IPU, by the way, is the global union of all parliaments. So it's parliaments themselves who have set for themselves benchmarks on what makes for a good democratic parliament. And also the open parliaments component of the Open Governance Partnership, OGP. All these put together into measurable issues that we can run across the various parliaments. We set for ourselves an index that would measure all African parliaments along these lines equally and release at the same time. So the Maiden Open Parliament Index, which was launched in 2022, sorry, I beg your pardon, 2022, was only a pilot. So it focused only on West Africa. And the next index, by the way, is coming up later this year, 2024, which is now going to take into account West Africa, East Africa, and possibly Southern Africa. So relatively
Exciting.
bigger. Very exciting. And so that's what we set for ourselves to do. Now, in this West African specific index, which measured 13 out of the 15 West African countries, and we didn't measure the other 2 because they were undergoing military rule at the time and parliaments were not functional, in the case of Mali and Guinea-Conakry. We discovered a few very interesting things. The first thing is that of the benchmarks that were used and the measurements that were used, the most open parliament in West Africa, which is Ghana, scored a pulsating 63%. So your highest ranking, most open, most transparent, accountable, and citizens participating parliament in West Africa, scored 63. In many academic institutions, that will not pass for a first class. And you
It's
have absolutely, but that's what Ghana led with. You have aside the first 3 parliaments on the list, every other parliament scored below 50%, on the benchmarks. So it shows how extremely low the baseline. And we were just trying to gather the baseline so that we can also measure some level of improvement. We also realized that whereas there's a lot of positives in the side of parliamentary transparency. Parliaments are doing a lot of interesting things that is making parliaments closer to the people. So in many of the countries, access to information laws have been passed, and so you can request for information. In many of the countries, parliaments are streaming live on Facebook, and so you don't necessarily have to be physically present. Parliaments are using internet and technology to get closer to the people. In many of the parliaments, they have radio stations that are attached to parliament who are broadcasting the proceedings of parliament. In many of the parliaments, they are having these kinds of things, parliamentary agenda, the minutes of parliamentary sittings, the official report or Hansards from parliaments are available online. You can download them and all of that. Those are great stuff, and we noticed that parliaments scored higher in these areas of transparency, making parliamentary information available, accessible, and all of that. The only low point to it is that in many of these instances, the information, although available, are not reusable. So they are not in open formats that can make you, analyze the information easily, that can make you, assess it easily. In many of the instances also, Parliament sees making information accessible as purely internet-based, and on a continent where internet penetration can be a bit of a challenge for people who are living in rural areas, then you have a situation which we describe here at PN Africa as the opposite of democratization of parliamentary information. Whereas parliament belongs to everybody, parliamentary information is not democratized. Those who are living in the bigger cities have access. Those who are living in the smaller and rural communities don't have access to parliamentary information. So that was one of the discoveries that we made in the area of transparency. In the area of citizens' participation, we realized that it's a mixed feeling. Some countries are engaging very well with civil society on matters relating to parliaments, mainly the Anglophone, countries, the Francophone countries, are now peaking. Civil society don't have as big an engagement with parliament as in their Anglophone, counterparts, as we discovered in the index. There were instances where in some parliaments there are close to no engagement between parliament and civil society at all. However, these parliaments are quick to want to engage with international institutions on the work that they do. When I talk about international institutions, things that brings up travel opportunities. So whereas they are not engaging with the organizations within their own countries, they are quick to attend the Commonwealth Parliamentarian Association's conferences of our times, and they are quick to attend the invitations of the EU Parliament and what have you. So those are things that we needed to flag. But the lowest points in the entire index, which had even the top parliament, that is Ghana, scoring very low on, is on the area of accountability, parliamentary accountability to the citizens. In parliamentary accountability, we are talking about how elected officials or representatives, parliamentarians, are accounting back to the people that have given them the mandate, because they are not representing themselves, they are representing a group of people. And so you find in many instances where there are no systems to get parliamentarians reporting back to their constituents on what they are doing, what parliament has done, how that is inuring to their benefits as local community people, and what have you. There is also the bit about no accountability on resources that are allocated to these members of parliament to run their parliamentary offices or their parliamentary roles. No accountability. People are hiring parliamentary staffers without recourse to best practices. People are bringing in their relatives, people are bringing in their party apparatchiks to fill in some of these roles and what have you. No real accountability. But also the institutions of parliaments themselves. For an institution that is actually overseeing the executive branch and how much comes in and how much it spends, we discovered that not a single parliament in West Africa actually publishes their own parliamentary budgets, their own parliamentary expenditure, their own parliamentary procurement in an open manner in a way that is globally acceptable. Not a single one of them. And I don't think that this is something that we would only discover in West Africa. In fact, it is our contention that if we expand this to East and Southern Africa, and even North Africa and Central Africa, and if we expand this beyond Africa, we will find many, many parliaments on various continents who are saying we are overseeing the executive and how are you spending? Come to PAC, Public Accounts Committee, and account for what you've spent as the executive branch. Yet the institutions of parliament are very opaque with their own finances. So that was a very interesting point that was noted, by us. In fact, it was only the Parliament of Cabo Verde that actually has some semblances of publishing some information relating to their parliamentary budget and parliamentary expenditure. Aside Cabo Verde, every other parliament will make the argument that, well, but our budget is part of the national budget anyways. But you see, the best practice is that we don't want to see the national budget and be confused with the numbers. We want to see what the legislative branch has as its budget, how the legislative branch went ahead to expend those, what are some of the infractions that were discovered, how are we dealing with those infractions? Because you need to build that moral right as the organization that is overseeing the executive branch to be able to hold the executive branch to account. So those were some of the discoveries we made in the OPI, which were quite staggering and interesting for us as assessors of the index.
Well, on your very last point, I can't think of a single watchdog that likes to be watched, right? And I guess that I told you off camera that one of the reasons I love doing this podcast is because of how much I learn from the guests. And this is another example, Sammy. I was just doing a contract for a client uh, related to the setting up of a parliamentary service commission in an Asian parliament. And we actually interviewed the secretary to the Parliamentary Services Board in Ghana as part of that research project. But it never occurred to me in all the questions that we asked. It never occurred to me to ask. It was all focused on autonomy from the executive. How are you able to set up your own budget independently? Et cetera, et cetera. But it never occurred to me to think about the perspective that you just raised, which is how accountable is Parliament to the public for the funds that it spends. That's a very, very interesting, very, very relevant point. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just making the point that the research pointed to the fact that this is pervasive. It's with all of the 13 parliaments that we reviewed in the index. And I dare say that if we expand this to 50 parliaments, we may discover similar threats across the board.
Yeah, I mean, you have the potential, and you're already doing this, but really to create an agenda for action for the whole continent in terms of some of the issues that you find. It's easy to go into one parliament and say you need to do this, but to be able to say that this is lacking across the continent, creates some real potential for an entry point for significant change. What is it that you think is the reason that parliamentarians and parliaments, because you talked earlier about, for the parliamentary side, parliamentary accountability to constituents, reporting back to constituents, which I mean is again, I'll that I've worked around the world, but I also am very active in watching my own politics in my own country. And one of the things I could say about Canadian politicians, and I could criticize them until the cows come home, but one of the things I could say is they do not take that for granted. They do not take reporting back to their constituents. They do not take that openness for granted, because they know that, we are a first past the post single member district system across the country, with the exception of 2 northern legislatures. In order to be elected, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you are listening to your constituents, that you're reporting back to them. Why is that something that has not taken hold in the African context?
Well, a couple of reasons can be cited for this. In some countries, I would argue that it's because of the legislative systems that the country practices. Right. I mean, the parliamentary system that a country practices, i.e., the kinds of elections that I mean, how parliamentarians are selected. Let me put it that way. So when you have an instance where members of parliament, I mean, not all countries practice the first past the post, system in the legislators. Some have the proportional representation arrangement where, depending on what percentage a particular political party wins at the polls, they nominate individuals, sometimes pre-selected names, into parliament based on those percentages. And so you have instances where people hold their loyalties to their political parties rather than to their constituents, for which reason they would rather do whatever the political party says just to maintain the ticket rather than to serve the people down there. And so they really would discard accountability. So that's one of the instances for those who practice especially the proportional representation system.
And I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second. This is a very low tech podcast, but so I don't have the ability to flash words across the screen, but you are talking about my favorite topic. My favorite. There is no topic that I love more than talking about electoral systems, and specifically the lack of accountability in the proportional representation system. I apologize for the interruption. I just had to tell you that I was just bursting with enthusiasm.
Many people have their own. There are many interesting schools of thoughts about these, systems, electoral systems, and the pros and cons and what have you. As a parliamentary watcher and somebody working within the parliamentary development space, I have my very strong views, about these systems and how they either promote the work of members of parliament as people who are representing their constituents, or rather take away from the promotion of same. But that's a conversation for perhaps another podcast on a different day. But even for those who are doing first past the post, direct elections and what have you, we are also seeing instances where the drivers of what makes people vote their members of parliament back to power has seemed to be shifting from how accountable the member of parliament is, how many times the member of parliament is coming around to tell us what's happening, to what kind of developmental projects the member of parliament is embarking on, and how the member of parliament's role is benefiting me personally. When we had a funeral in the community, did he attend? When the church invited him for the annual harvest to come make a donation, did he come? When the Muslims in the community were celebrating the Eid, did he make any significant donation of a big fat cow for us to mark the Eid with? And those become the things that people seem to measure the member of parliament with. For which reason, the member of parliament feels that to the extent that I do these things, I really don't need to come to you to tell you that Parliament is passing a bill on affirmative action, and this is what it's going to do to you, or Parliament is passing a policy that would affect your right to information or your pensions and what have you. And so those are some of the things that we are grappling with here, which actually has a major effect on parliamentarians being accountable to the citizens that they actually represent.
That's amazing. So in a way, the ends justify the means, right? The ends justify the means. The means, which is the way that Parliament operates and parliamentarians operate, is just part and parcel. It becomes irrelevant because what's really important is
about the next elections for many of the parliamentarians. So whatever will win the person the seat in the next elections, and this has accounted also for the cost of politics in our part of the world and in many parts of the world, because legislation around political campaign financing is lacking in many of these places, and it becomes so expensive to run for office, in many of these places, to the extent that some research in some of these countries are showing that it costs more to run for a seat in parliament in some countries than the combined salaries of these parliamentarians for the entire period that they serve as parliamentarians. And these are quite staggering, revelations.
And I just love how we're just working horizontally on this conversation, bringing in more and more elements that are interconnected. Another one of those is the constituent development funds, because that seems to me, I remember, when my first trip to Africa, and I'm pointing to you because you're Ghanaian, if I'm not mistaken. My first trip to Africa was 2007, and it was to Ghana. And I've been blessed to be back many times since then. But I remember, as I got to know the continent a little bit better, I'll say a little bit because I'm Canadian. I'll never know it as well as somebody who is from Africa, of course. But I was always surprised by how these constituent development funds, it seemed to me in 2007 to be an anomaly in terms of the ability for parliamentarians to be involved in making decisions regarding spending. It's getting more and more clear to me that you look at Kenya, which is actually, I think that was happening at the time where we were in Mombasa. They're looking at a constitutional amendment to ensure that parliamentarians continue to be involved in the constituent development funds. Isn't that something that really perpetuates this whole culture that you're talking about of what can, of making sure that parliamentarians have access to the cash to be able to give to their constituents, which de-emphasizes the need for that accountability?
Well, it does. It does perpetuate the problem. But, many parliamentarians will argue that it's actually a solution to a problem that we've not found a solution to. So this is how it started. For many of these countries, the only elected officials they know are the president they have elected and the parliamentarian they have elected. And for them, you are the drivers of development. For the president, he's sitting somewhere in the capital city. They hardly get to see him or her. He or she would come around when it's getting to elections. But for you, the parliamentarian, you are their folk. They elected you. And so they think that every developmental matter must be at your doorstep. Many of the countries have not, and Ghana is an example, have not gotten to the stage where they elect their local government officials, and so local government officials are not seen as directly responsible or directly accountable to the people, because the people don't have a means to sack you with the power of the thumb, if you are underperforming. And so they put all of those burden on the parliamentarians. Some will, however, argue that there are countries like Kenya, there are countries like Sierra Leone and the likes, where they elect local government officials, South Africa and co. But even there also, we are finding these challenges. And it's happening because many of us citizens feel that whereas we have elected you and you're representing us, you must bring some form of development. The members of parliament in their campaigning, or the aspiring members of parliament in their campaigning, go about promising heaven and earth, and rather do not stay clear of giving their people the indication that the work they are going to do is to represent them, to lobby for things to be brought to their constituencies, to make sure that legislation that are passed, have their interest at heart, to oversee the executive branch. These core functions of members of parliament. Aspiring parliamentarians go promising more. And they're telling you that we're going to bring schools and we're going to build roads and we're going to construct, hospitals, when they know that it does not remain within their mandate to do. Now, when they get elected, they now start to backtrack and say, this is not my duty. I am unable to do that. How much money do I have to do that? What resources do I have? Right? And so the people now vote them out and say, you promised us something else and you're doing something else. And of course, there's a new candidate who is also promising the same thing. And so the cycle goes on and on and on. So now members of parliament are making the argument that, okay, yes, we've created this problem on ourselves. We've gone to promise things that are not supposed to be our responsibility. And now it has become part of the things that people hold us accountable to. So please provide us some resources so that we can be seen to be some in the countries. Of course, in various countries, it is administered differently. In some countries, you have a constituency development fund administered to the member of parliament. There are specific kinds of projects that you can do with it. In the case of Ghana, for example, you have what is called the District Assembly's Common Fund, where you have the MP's share, or the member of parliament's share of the District Assembly's Common Fund. That money is not administered at all by the member of parliament. The member of parliament only indicates the kinds of, or recommends the kinds of projects that must be done with. Is a local government within the area that actually signs on the account and allocates the money. And it's a bit murky. People are looking for ways to be able to. So we've created a problem for ourselves through this development focused campaigning that we have sold to the constituents. And then when it comes to bite, we're asking for resources to be able to, feed this monster that we have created in a way that is also blurring the lines between the actual role of the parliamentarian and the institution of parliament versus the new role that is kind of being created now.
Wow. There's one other issue I want to raise with you before we wrap up, which is about Ghana itself. I've always had a strong affection for Ghana, particularly because of the fact that it was the first African country that I worked in. The fact that it's a long-standing democracy, many reasons, and some of the friends I've made there. Ghana's in debt distress. And I ask you this as a Ghanaian and as a parliamentary and civil society expert. Ghana's in debt distress. You mentioned that they, let me start again. Ghana's in debt distress. When I look at some of the indicators for Parliament's involvement and oversight in Ghana, there are areas where I see, for example, the lack of civic participation in Parliament, the lack of opportunity for citizen input into the formulation and approval stages of the budget, for example. I'm doing some work, and I tend to ramble a little bit sometimes when I've got multiple thoughts going on in my head, but I'm doing some work right now, which I'd like to share with you when it's ready, on the role of civil society in monitoring IMF agreements. Ghana has, of course, entered into an agreement. I think it's its 17th agreement, if I'm not mistaken, or 13th agreement. I can't remember the number. I might be confusing it with the Sri Lankan number, but they're close in terms of the number of times that the country has entered into an IMF agreement since independence. But my concern is the lack of, on one hand, I see strong civic participation in Ghana. I'm always shocked to hear that, for example, there are local organizations that are working with audit committees at the district level to ensure that audit recommendations are being implemented. I mean, you don't really see that anywhere else in the world, as far as I know. That's very, very unique. But at the same time, I'm concerned that the civic participation in Parliament is not strong enough to be able to actually ensure that Parliament is doing a good job in terms of overseeing public debt, for example, or meeting the targets of the IMF agreement. What are your thoughts on that? Sorry for the long question.
That's okay. And yes, you're right that this is the 17th IMF bailout, since
17.
independence,
Yeah.
as Ghana is concerned. For a country that is now, that is almost hitting its 70th anniversary of independence, to have gone to the IMF 17 times gives you an indication of how often we do go. An average of about 4 years, we end up with the IMF and what have you. The thing with Parliament's role in public debt management and all of these issues, public debt, is that I think that successive parliaments had not really seen themselves very integral in the whole public debt, space. And parliaments had not come to terms with how critical their roles are in this whole conversation, and usually left it to the executive branch to mismanage and mismanage and mismanage until it comes down to the wire, and then members of parliament start to scream because their constituents are suffering and their constituents are threatening them to lose in the next election. And so for electoral purposes and for various parties, they go about to cry for the necessary reforms. But like you rightly starts from the budget formulation. Of course, I believe that our constitution, provides some very, very terrible situation on Parliament's role in the whole budget formulation processes, in that there is a limit to what Parliament can really, really do when it comes to, approving the national budget, on an annual basis. And so we run a system where the ceilings cannot be touched. You can only just do some reallocations here and there from one sector, or recommend for reallocations here and there from one sector to the other when the whole issue have got into Parliament. And Parliament is almost never involved in the processes leading up to the budget being presented before Parliament. It is now that Parliament is looking at passing the budget bill, which will now increase its role in the whole process, and also seek to establish the Parliamentary Budget Office and all of that. But we've had these conversations. We've had organizations advocate for this for many, many years. Hopefully, it sees the light of day. Hopefully, very, very soon. And so Parliament had defaulted or had not exerted its authority very well in that area. Of course, I attribute many of that to the constitutional restrictions. But when the budget also gets to Parliament, you usually have a situation where the budget is presented sometime in November. Parliament's got 6 weeks, 8 weeks maximum to look at this. And by the time it comes in November, that's the first,
like Malawi, where it's 2 weeks.
Well, yes, but it's still terrible. And of course, I'm saying this,
I should say a lot in quotation. Yeah.
But you see, it also goes to the kind of terrible situation that our parliaments across the continent and in many other countries outside of the continent are put in. That you only see the budget for the very first time 2 to 6 weeks before it must be passed, and you're expected to go through the entire process and pass it anyways. And so, what's going to happen is a firefighting approach really to the entire process, and that limits the level of citizens' participation, because you asked this question anchored on the premise of civic participation. So parliaments will argue that we've got just 2 weeks to be able to do this. If we say we are going to have consultations with civil society and with academia and with all other stakeholders, it's going to take all of the time. We don't have time, right? And so then our abilities to engage in the process is limited because Parliament is complaining about time and the kind of work that they need to do according to their parliamentary practices and procedures. Now, when this is over and it's been approved and spending takes place, parliaments are usually not exerting their oversight responsibility in a way that allows for checks and balances, but are often waiting for the final reports to appear before the Public Accounts Committee for vetting. But during the period of implementation, who is monitoring the level, the volumes of loan proposals that are coming to Parliament for approval and checking whether it is going beyond the ceiling or remaining within the threshold? Who is ensuring that state-owned enterprises are not overspending in a way that cripples the financial situation of the country? Who is ensuring that the Office of Government Machinery, the presidency, and his ministers are not completely bloated in a way that is actually putting too much pressure on the public finances of the country? We watch on, allow these to go on as Parliament until now the year ends. Auditor General does the audit. And by the way, until recently, Auditor General's reports for 4 years, 3 years will now be discussed. So we had a huge backlog in Ghana where, let's cite an example. So for example, in 2024, you'll still have Parliament discussing the Auditor General's reports of 2020 or of 2021, by which time the infractions have happened, new years have come up, people have retired, people have died, and accountability becomes a problem. All of these, together with many more reasons, are the reasons we are where we are. And for me, I think one of the big recommendations, especially for the Parliament of Ghana, because you cited this as a Ghana example, is how to get the institution of Parliament and members of Parliament to understand their role in public debt management. Know that Parliament truly has a role to play, and how to get us, even as civil society. But for the Mombasa meeting, there were so many things, even as a parliamentary development person that I am, that I really, really did not have a clue about on what Parliament's real role could be in this whole, situation. And I think members of Parliament also do not understand it that much. And that could be one of the that could be one of the solutions, really, going forward, to getting Parliament of Ghana to play a bigger role in the whole debt management processes.
Okay, so you are the first person I know who has ever answered a question by describing the role of the Ghanaian Parliament, or any parliament for that matter, in every stage of the budget process. Your response covered the formulation, approval, implementation, and audit oversight stage. That was epic. Wow. If I asked someone a question like that, I strongly doubt that they would provide an answer that was as comprehensive as that. If I had deliberately posed that question, that was very impressive. Go ahead. Sorry. Please.
I was saying that I sat at your feet to learn one or two things about public financial management. And so I learned the entire thing.
Well, we're learning from each other, trust me. I often have a very strong sense of regret in these interviews that we can't continue and ask more questions, but this is, I think, a good place for us to stop for this discussion, bearing in mind that I think we're going to have to do this again sometime in the next, maybe within this calendar year. Thank you so much, Sammy Obeng, Executive Director, Parliamentary Network Africa. Absolutely epic, incredible discussion. So enlightening and inspiring.
Happy to have been on this podcast, and I look forward to more and more of these. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.